For most of history, warfare was ruthless, yet remarkably inexpensive. Not cheap in ethical terms, but cheap in logistical and material terms. Armies were drawn from men who already lived and worked nearby. Weapons were often everyday tools repurposed for combat. Campaigns followed the seasons, ended quickly, and were restricted by distance, food, and fatigue. Rulers didn't need financial experts to wage war. They needed loyalty, horses, and patience. Then a single innovation overturned that balance. Gunpowder didn't merely increase destruction, it transformed war into something costly. And once war became costly, it stopped measuring bravery and started measuring financial capacity. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history intersect, and nothing is ever as straightforward as it seems. Before gunpowder, authority was divided. Medieval Europe was a loose network of lords, vassals, and personal obligations between individuals. Armies existed temporarily. Farmers were called to fight, then returned home to harvest. Knights paid for their own equipment. Castles were built to defend territory, not to conquer it. Conflict had built-in limits because it depended on people who still needed to survive. No ruler could sustain endless war, and no ruler needed to. Push too hard, and forces dissolved. Supplies disappeared. Allegiances fractured. Limits on warfare emerged naturally, without written rules. Gunpowder entered Europe quietly in the late Middle Ages. At first, it didn't seem impressive. Early cannons were unreliable. Firearms were slow and inaccurate. Established elites dismissed gunpowder weapons as loud novelties. They misunderstood its importance, though not for the usual reason. Gunpowder wasn't transformative because it killed armored knights. It was transformative because it eliminated inexpensive warfare. Artillery reshaped siege warfare almost immediately. Stone walls that had protected cities for generations collapsed under sustained fire. Defenses had to be rebuilt, thicker, lower, and angled. That required specialists, materials, time, capital. Firearms redefined armies. Training a knight took decades. Training a musketeer took months. But only if a state could afford weapons, powder, logistics, and constant resupply. Battles were no longer decided by what soldiers carried. They were decided by what governments could deliver to the battlefield. War stopped being local. It became industrial in scale. Permanent armies replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer part-time fighters. They became full-time professionals who required steady pay. Armies no longer disappeared after campaigns. They remained active, drilling and consuming resources even in peacetime. Success no longer belonged to the bravest. It belonged to those who could keep paying. This marked the beginning of political centralization. Local lords couldn't afford artillery. Small realms couldn't maintain modern fortifications. Feudal duties couldn't support continuous warfare. Only centralized states with stable revenue endured. Gunpowder didn't just bring down castles, it dismantled decentralization itself. Once rulers realized war now depended on money, a new challenge emerged: how to secure enough of it. Occasional taxes were insufficient. Emergency levies couldn't sustain permanent forces. So governments made a radical shift. They made taxation permanent. What had once been temporary became routine. What had once required negotiation became assumed. Loyalty alone was no longer enough. Subjects now owed money. Even that failed to cover the costs. Gunpowder wars were expansive, prolonged, and relentless. Cannons, powder, fortifications, ships, and professional soldiers cost more than taxes could provide. So states turned to borrowing. This is where finance truly enters the picture. Debt stopped being a last resort and became a deliberate strategy. Wars were financed through bonds, credit became a weapon. Bankers replaced nobles as the ruler's most valuable allies. A ruler who could borrow could outlast one who couldn't, even if the latter was more popular. War was no longer limited by manpower, it was limited by credit, and that changed everything. Once war could be financed, it could continue beyond public tolerance. Costs could be spread across generations. Losses postponed. Inflation quietly absorbed part of the burden. Entire populations were mobilized financially without ever stepping onto a battlefield. This marked the emergence of the modern state: permanent taxation, standing armies, public debt, centralized authority. None of this came from theory. It emerged because gunpowder made traditional warfare unaffordable. The human consequences were severe. Taxes rose. Wages failed to keep pace with prices. Savings lost value. Debts outlived rulers and burdened generations who never approved the wars or even lived through them. Yet the system persisted because it worked. Gunpowder redefined the cost of war, and in doing so, permanently reshaped the relationship between money and power. Once war became a permanent expense, states faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't fund it transparently. Raising taxes risked rebellion. Excessive borrowing risked collapse. Cutting military spending meant falling behind rivals, so governments chose a quieter solution. They altered how the cost of war was felt by society. This is where inflation enters, not by accident and not as a modern invention, but as a structural response to the gunpowder economy. Inflation existed long before. Ancient rulers debased coins in emergencies, but those episodes were brief and dangerous. Pushed too far, and trust vanished. Soldiers rejected pay. Markets froze. Regimes collapsed. Gunpowder warfare changed that logic. When war became permanent, states needed a way to distribute its costs slowly, quietly, and across people far removed from the battlefield. Inflation accomplished exactly that. Rather than extracting wealth directly through taxes, governments altered the value of money itself. Instead of demanding more today, they demanded less tomorrow. The burden didn't vanish. It faded. Before gunpowder, inflation addressed short-term crises. After gunpowder, it stabilized entire systems. Gunpowder wars were continuous drains. Cannons needed replacement. Powder spoiled. Weapons wore down. Fortifications required upkeep. Armies consumed resources daily. Taxes couldn't keep pace. Debt filled the gap. But debt required repayment. Inflation softened that burden too. As prices rose, the real value of debt declined. Governments learned, gradually, then deliberately, that mild inflation reduced past obligations without outright default. Creditors were repaid in numerical terms, not in real purchasing power. Resistance was limited. The process remained largely unseen. War became socially manageable. This explains why inflation becomes persistent in gunpowder-era states. Not explosive, not hyperinflation, which still destroys governments, but steady erosion. Enough to relieve pressure, enough to buy time. Once established, this logic spread beyond warfare. Military spending became permanent, debt rolled forward, inflation became expected. Financial systems evolved to manage strain rather than eliminate it. Central authority expanded because coordination became essential. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder economy. Not simply larger wars, but wars sustained by finance. Violence no longer required immediate approval. It required liquidity. Opposition could be exhausted. Costs delayed. Sacrifice spread broadly across society. Society adapted. Those who never fought still paid. Savings declined quietly. Wages lagged. Generations inherited obligations they never chose. This durability defines modern states. Today, war is constrained less by soldiers than by budgets. Aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber capabilities, and logistics networks are financial commitments as much as military ones. The decisive question is no longer who fights better. It's who can afford long-term endurance. Restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from cost. When cost is deferred or disguised through finance, restraint weakens. War isn't inevitable, but it is embedded in modern systems. As long as systems exist to sustain it, the bond between money and violence remains strong, even when conflict feels distant. This is why discussions of debt, inflation, and public finance cannot be separated from power. These are not abstract ideas. They are mechanisms that allow states to project force without collapsing. Yes ko 15 jagah ma divide karo. Gunpowder taught a harsh lesson. Endurance belongs to those who control finance. Recognizing this isn't cynical, it's realistic. So, when people wonder why governments borrow endlessly, why military budgets feel permanent, or why inflation quietly erodes savings, the answer isn't in recent headlines. It lies centuries ago, when technology made violence too expensive to manage through informal systems. Gunpowder didn't just transform war, it redefined what power required to survive. The lesson isn't that technology is evil or finance corrupt. It's that systems adapt to the costs they must absorb. And when those costs grow large enough, they reshape institutions, money, and everyday life. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes relentlessly. When power becomes expensive, money fills the gap. And once that bridge is built, it is rarely torn down. If this perspective changed how you see history, subscribe. The past still has answers, and I'll help you find them.